Hello, welcome to Under the Microscope. I'm your host, Jenny Germano, and thank you for joining me today. Today's topic is going to be an inside look at cannabis policy and what operators need to know. A little bit about my background. I got my start in cannabis in 2009, working in vertically integrated operations in Denver, Colorado. And in 2015, I founded my company, ICS Consulting Service, and I have been consulting in the United States nationally for the last 10 years. Please give a warm welcome to my guest, Jordan Wellington from Strategies 64. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, I'm very happy to have you today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm thrilled to be a guest on your podcast.
Why don't you go ahead and give our listeners a little bit about your background, when you entered into the cannabis industry, and I guess a little bit of the history of Jordan Wellington, and then what you're doing now currently.
Yeah, happy to sum up the last 15 years or so of my life in just a few minutes. I'm a policy wonk and proud child of the great state of New Jersey, but fortunately I don't have to live there anymore. So I went to law school in Brooklyn and then served as a bill drafter in the New Jersey State Legislature for a couple of years. My wife was working at the Hudson River Museum in Yonkers, and I was working in Trenton. So folks who are familiar with that geography as well as the traffic probably are like, how could you be married to someone and bridge that commute? And the answer is we couldn't. And I was pretty miserable and commuting like 6 hours a day on the train for a while, and eventually just got fed up with it and ran away to Denver, Colorado, where I had some family to escape a bit of the East Coast rat race. I was fortunate enough to have some folks who knew some people out here in the great state of Colorado that turned out to be working in government and public policy, which is my area of focus and really what I've done with my career. So I was a glorified intern in the House Majority Office under Speaker Mark Ferrandino after Colorado passed Amendment 64. So I moved out here in July of 2012. And in the beginning of 2013, after the vote in November of 2012 to legalize cannabis, legislation came before the General Assembly to consider how to implement the law. I showed up to work one day. I had been working on things ranging from civil unions to gun control and other things that the Democrats were working on that year. I showed up to work one day, and my boss at the time, the legislative director, Ian Silveri, who's an amazing friend and wonderful person, called me into his office. He had a whiteboard behind him and erased everything that he had under my name on the whiteboard and drew a big pot leaf and said, "You're now in charge of implementing Amendment 64 and working on marijuana legalization." And I said, "Oh, dear God, I need to get a job. I'm like married. I'd love to have a kid one day. I have massive amount of law school debt. Please don't make me the pot guy." And he said, "Fuck no, this isn't a democracy. Go do what I told you." And he's also from New Jersey. So this was like totally normative behavior for the two of us. He wasn't being rude or anything like that. And so I said, okay, he's go find Majority Leader Dan Pabon, who was going to be the point person for the House Democrats running the bill, and you're going to go help him. And in my background, I thought, okay, cool. I'm going to be like low man on the totem pole doing some grunt work. Lo and behold, I show up and it's like Dan and I, and that's it. And so I overnight became the guy who shepherded the bills implementing the legalization of marijuana through the House and the Senate. First, we had the joint select committee between the House and the Senate, and then the bills went through each chamber. And Dan and I jokingly laugh, like I used to sleep with my cell phone under my pillow for several weeks to not wake my wife up, and then go take phone calls in the walk-in closet in our studio apartment when Dan would call me at 1 a.m. because he was juggling a bunch of stuff, and we would have to figure out how to get these bills through the legislature. And we got them through the legislature in 2.5 weeks, a total of 13 working days without going to conference committee. So it was one of the great accomplishments of my career. After the session ends in Colorado, all the legislators go to a bar usually, or a lot of folks go to this bar called Stoney's near the state capitol. A lot of the lobbyists all go down there on sine die. And so I went down there. We passed the bill. I was super excited. And the executive director of the Department of Revenue comes up to me at the bar and she's, "Jordan, you're the only one who knows what this bill means." She's, "You know what everything means, and everyone else worked on a little piece of it. Will you come work at the Marijuana Enforcement Division to help us write the regulations?" And I was like, "That's fascinating. I could really use a job." "Sure, absolutely." And I talked to a bunch of friends and mentors, and they were like, "That's like literally the nerdiest possible thing you could do." And I'm like, "Yeah, I think so." So I went in-house with the Marijuana Enforcement Division, and worked there for 8 or 9 months. I was under a temporary contract with the state. Before you go through the full like civil service program and they hire
Sure.
you as an FTE, I was under a temporary contract. And so I worked with Louis Koski and Ron Tamrizel and some other folks. And we basically wrote the first ever regulations governing adult use marijuana after passing the first ever bill to implement adult use marijuana in the world. Because the last time marijuana was legal, there wasn't a regulatory state to regulate it. It's not how we
Nope.
did things 100 years ago. And after a while, I just came to the conclusion that it was not the place long term for me. I made some amazing friends there. Ron and Lou are still friends to this day and unbelievable mentors and people I appreciate the relationship I have with. But at the end of the day, especially back then, the Marijuana Enforcement Division was a law enforcement agency.
It was.
And there were a lot of cops with a lot of guns. And I'm a nice Jewish hippie from New Jersey who does not do guns and decided my tribe is really the people trying to legalize marijuana, not the folks with guns trying to regulate the industry. And so I called my friend Christian Cedarberg, who I'd become very close with throughout the implementation process, and was like, I want to come work at Vicente Cedarberg. You guys are legalizing marijuana and doing fun stuff. And I don't think I had any idea what I was asking for. I'd never worked inside a law firm in my entire life. I don't think I ever wanted to work at a law firm, but we went out to dinner, Christian, Josh Capel, and I, and cut some kind of a deal. And then I went back to work the next day and told Ron and Lou, and they were like, all right, you're crossing the other side. You got to get out. Not really. They were nice about it, and they were very appreciative and understood it. But I wrapped up my tenure with the Marijuana Enforcement Division and went in-house at Vicente Cedarberg. I think I was probably like employee number like 8 or 9 at that point. Helped create the regulatory compliance department. My favorite part of my job was I oversaw our clerkship program and hired probably about 35 to 40 young attorneys over the years, some of whom are partners at Vicente Cedarberg or partners in other firms or work in government and different government offices around the country, work as attorneys in all different kinds of cannabis businesses in-house, as well as non-attorneys that I had the pleasure of hiring and mentoring, like some of the folks like Genevieve Meehan and Andrew Livingston, who we were talking about before. Although technically I didn't hire Andrew, but he is my brother from another mother and my policy partner in crime. And so I was there for many years, had a short stint where I left to go work at a software company that I helped co-found, but decided that was not the long-term seat for me either. And after a lot of kind of deciding what to do, I chose to come back to the Vicente Cedarberg family. But instead I went into VS Strategies, which is a sister firm, or was a sister firm at the time, that focused on government affairs and public policy consulting, which was really what I wanted to do with my time. I like doing compliance work, but I was not a billable hours kind of guy, and just decided that was not really where my life was headed. And I'd known Steve Fox for almost a decade at that point, and in 2019 came back to VS Strategies. And then have been there ever since. And when Steve passed away, I became the managing partner. And so our firm works with governments and trade associations and businesses all across the country, really on the question of how do you regulate cannabis responsibly? Now, what that means in practice is we track every law, rule, and regulation that impacts cannabis anywhere in the country, as well as in the world. And we work with businesses of all kinds, doing things like helping them understand where the laws are moving and where opportunities are changing and where problems might occur, and how to work with regulators to influence and change regulations that are problematic, or work with states to help them implement a program that will be operable. We do fun stuff like write white papers, have a business intelligence reporting service called Cannabispolicy Advisor, and do all kinds of fun, nerdy stuff around cannabis policy. Oh, and I have a podcast called The Weed Wonks, which is my favorite part of my job because it's just for fun and I get to talk to amazing people. I don't know if that was short or long enough or enough of a bio.
It was very, let's say it was very Jordan. So it doesn't, it
was very Jordan.
It's a Jordan. It fits into a Jordan category. And I'm glad you brought up Weed Wonks, because I made sure to write down to tell people about, if they wanted to follow your podcast, the name of it. So that's really helpful. I guess
very Jordan means it was like interesting and rambly and somewhere in the realm of coherent. I'll call that a win.
Win. I love it. I wanted to start with the basics first, just in case there's any new operators listening and maybe they don't understand really how cannabis policy works. So I was just curious if you can just go over how cannabis policy is made, or just the process. And is the process pretty much the same in every state, or is it unique to every state?
Yes. So first of all, I used to actually teach a class at DU back many years ago called Regulating Cannabis. It was my stealth way to teach law students civics by using the cannabis plant as a lore. And so one of my fervent beliefs is that it's unbelievable that they don't teach civics in school anymore, that you could literally graduate law school in this country and not understand basic civics. As part of that class, I told everybody to go watch the old Schoolhouse Rock video, How a Bill Becomes a Law. So I would, if anyone's not sure, I would suggest watching that cartoon. It takes about 3 minutes and it gives you the basics. Laws in our country are basically made two different ways. One, you can have a ballot initiative process. So that's not covered in the Schoolhouse Rock video. That's where you can run an initiative like Amendment 64 or Prop 64 in California, Amendment 64 in Colorado, and people vote. And that can be a constitutional initiative. Constitution is the highest law of the state, or a statutory initiative. That's in the middle. That's the stuff the legislature makes. The legislature makes laws outside of this ballot initiative process. A particular representative or senator will introduce a piece of legislation. That legislation will then be voted on by a committee or multiple committees, which is a small group of legislators. A person in the House of Representatives introduces a bill to, let's say this year, create regulatory efficiency in the Colorado marijuana industry, which is something that we worked on and I'm sure we'll get to chat about. That bill goes to a specific committee of reference, a small group of legislators that focus on a specific type of issue. We'll review that legislation, make potential amendments, and then send it on its way. It may go through multiple committees or a single committee, depending on the type of legislation and whether it requires the state to appropriate funds or anything like that. Once it gets through the committee process, it will go to the committee of the whole, which is basically the entire House of Representatives. It's voted on twice there, first on second reading and then third reading. And the legislators will debate it, make more amendments, then wait 24 hours and vote on it again to make sure they agreed with their vote from the day before. So that's second and third reading. Once you get through that process, which sounds long and arduous and exhausting because it is, you get the distinct pleasure of doing it all over again in the other house. So bills that start in the House, then go to the Senate, bills that start in the Senate, then go to the House. Go through the exact same process of committee, second and third reading. And if you are fortunate enough to have the second House pass the bill in the exact same form as it passed the first group of elected officials, then your bill is done and it goes to the governor. But most people do not run for office thinking that they will just follow along with their colleagues. They think their opinions are important too. And so for the most part, the second House will make amendments. And then it has to go back to either be concurred or conference committee to the original House. So bill starts in the House, gets through, goes to the Senate. If the Senate does everything fine and doesn't change anything, then you're done when it passes. But most of the time they do tweak something and then the two groups have to agree. So that's very typical of what happens. And then the bill is still not law. It usually needs to be signed by the governor or allowed to go into law as without his signature, which can happen. And so when I say, when you're like, is it the same or is it different in different states? That process at a 50,000 foot level is 100% the same in pretty much every state. But there's all kinds of rules and particulars and timing and changes that each state has in their own process. And then just for fun, once you get towards the end of a legislative session, because these are bodies of elected officials, they can change or suspend the rules at any time if they need to get something done. So exactly how it works is the technicals can change. Once you get through the statutory level, you then go to administrative rulemaking, which is a little bit more straightforward. You have an administrative agency in Colorado, the Marijuana Enforcement Division, will propose a set of regulations. People will sit around and talk about them. They will make changes to them. Eventually, they will go before an administrative hearing judge who will basically hear the divisions saying, we should propose these rules, and this is why it makes sense. This is why it falls within the boundaries of statute, because the administrative agency can only do what the legislature tells them to do. Assuming all those boxes are checked, then those become law as well. So it's a very involved and long process.
And actually, that was really helpful. And I did see the video. I remember that. I'm a kid of the 80s. I remember that video very well on becoming a bill. And
I made law students watch that video.
I'm hoping that people are still watching that video. The detail that you gave was really helpful, and I definitely appreciate that.
I would encourage everybody to curiously ask, why could the people in charge of our country not want the citizens to understand how laws are made and changed? Like, why are we not teaching civics in high school? Seems like it's important in a democracy, But it's true. You can actually graduate law school without having any understanding of the basics of what I just talked about, which
Yeah, that's
blows my
pretty
mind.
fascinating. It's cool because we're getting educated now. So maybe there's somebody listening who didn't even know that. Another thing I want to talk about, do you think there's misconceptions that operators might have about how policy works in the cannabis industry?
All the time and all day long. So one of the biggest misconceptions that I find is why people do things and why laws exist the way they do. And so there's just all these misconceptions because the private sector and the public sector work entirely differently. They're completely different structures and incentive structures. And so if you believe in the rational actor theory and therefore human beings are largely incentive processing computers and simply respond and react to the incentives put before them, which is something I believe, all of a sudden, if you change the incentives and the conditions under which people will or won't be successful, they will behave entirely differently. And so one of the biggest challenges that we work with, especially when I have to work with a CEO, when I work with an in-house government affairs or attorney person, they tend to understand this. But a lot of business people will be like, why isn't the government doing it like this? That's because you would do it like that because you work in the private sector and success and failure is measured differently. In the public sector, success and failure is measured in a very different way, and they are just responding to the incentives put for them. In the private sector, to be successful, you need to run a business. You need money coming in the door. You need to be able to charge a price and market your product in a way that people will buy it. And it's a very tricky balance, right? How do you get your name out there? How do you get people to give you money? Whether you're running a dispensary or a consulting firm, it's essentially the same structure. In the government, like at the Marijuana Enforcement Division, you establish a fee and the businesses have to pay that fee. And you don't really get to keep any of the money because the legislature oversees your entire budget. So people will be like, oh, yeah, the Med just wants to do this so they could issue a whole bunch of fines. And it's like, they don't really get to keep any of that money. And the people who work there don't make any more or less money based on the number of fines they issue. There's actually very little financial incentive for them to issue fines. Instead, the pressure comes from the public and the legislature who get upset with them when something goes wrong. And
Yeah.
so the incentive is not to generate revenue. The incentive is to avoid situations in which you can get blamed or something could go wrong and that it can be your fault. And that makes sense, right? Like, that's not a bad thing. That's the way government should work. It's more about understanding why people are behaving the way they are and why they're making the choices they are. So if you're frustrated with why an administrative agency is doing something and you would like them to do something differently, it's really important to understand what their incentives are so you can work with them to say, hey, look, you're not a bad guy. You're doing your job. You're doing the best you can. Here's the problem this is causing me. Here's how we can fix it. And you need to make sure that your solution is not, and you can get more money because that doesn't matter to them. It's that this will be safe and okay. And that there will not be people getting sick. There will not be increased diversion. There will not be increased youth access. That those are the things that they're motivated by. And so at its core, one of the main things I think people don't understand about public policy is the people making public policy are subject to an entirely different set of incentives and structures than the private sector. And that's at its core, one of the things people don't understand.
Yeah. And a lot of other misconceptions that I find, I know you because we were in Colorado work groups together. And as somebody who audits these facilities, operators going in, a lot of the complaints I hear are directly at the regulators, right? They're very mad at the regulators or they're blaming the regulators for a rule or a policy change. And a lot of times I'm in those work groups and I know where that's coming from, and it's actually not from the regulators, right? The regulators, they're just doing their job. It's their job to make sure the rules are getting implemented with the stakeholders. And a lot of times people blame them for things that they can't control. They just have to do their job. And so I always find that's another misconception a lot because I get the experience of being on both sides by being in the work groups and then going out and then being in these facilities and then hearing what people are saying to me.
Yeah. Regulators are given a to-do list by the legislature.
Yeah.
They do not have control over the to-do list. They have control in certain instances about how to accomplish the tasks on their to-do list, but they do not have control over the to-do list itself. And that is a really important thing to understand, because if you want to fix something and change it, you need to direct your request to the right group of people. And if you pound your fist on the table at a regulator saying, I want you to change this, it's a problem, and they're like, yeah, it's in statute. A lot of times they could be like, I don't think it's a good idea either. But the only way to do it is to get those folks in that building with the golden dome on the top of it to change their mind, or you can run for office and try to get your colleagues to change their mind. And it's a huge misconception that people have about how this stuff works. I find also that the people in the cannabis community, and I don't mean just the industry community, sometimes we live in a bit of a bubble.
Yeah.
And so things that we know are either a bad idea or ridiculous or don't make sense, most people outside the bubble don't. Or maybe everybody in the cannabis community or cannabis industry thinks something is stupid. That's cool. But like, the elected officials are responsive to their entire constituency. And there may be a lot of people outside of our bubble that don't think it's a bad idea. And I see people sometimes using an argument that I, as a cannabis person, I'm like, yeah, I get where you're coming from. But I also know it's going to fall on deaf ears to people outside of our universe. And that's especially true in cannabis, because in some ways, the cannabis community is an insular community, which happens when people threaten to put you in a cage and take your kids away for using cannabis. So like, we are insular as a reaction to the conditions in which we operate. But it's really important to remember, like, these things are decided on by people who have to answer to people inside and outside the cannabis community who maybe don't even understand the cannabis plant all that well. And so it's your job to educate them. You have to meet them where they're at. You have to communicate them in a way that they understand it. And as with most things in life, yelling at people is usually an ineffective tactic to get them to agree with you, despite how frustrated you are and legitimate your frustrations might be.
Yeah, it doesn't go very far. Somebody's been in work groups, and I watch people get out of line and just get triggered, and I don't think it goes very far. I know there's one controversial in particular would be the concentrate flyer in Colorado. For those that are listening, we have this concentrate flyer, which has to be attached to every concentrate container or exit bag as it leaves the door in Colorado. When I go in and audit these facilities, the biggest complaint is the concentrate flyer. Why do I have to do this? The MED, it's all their fault, and they blame the MED, but it actually wasn't the MED. There was actually a group, I believe, I can't remember the name of the group, but I remember from Blue
Rising.
Blue Rising that got that through. And I always tell people, do your research, look it up. It wasn't because of the MED.
I'm not going to speak for the MED, but I will say, I think any rational individual would look at that public policy and think it's stupid. And to be very clear, it's because the flyer is not going, like, it's a multi-page flyer. It talks about concentrate safety and poison control numbers and portion size, which is my favorite part, because there was a lot of arguments about what the portion size should be. And I was the one pounding my fist on the table being like, it should be, the only acceptable solution here is a visual image. And people were like, no, it should be 1/10 of a gram. And I'm like, first of all, you obviously have never seen a dab, because that's like an enormous amount of concentrate.
Oh my gosh.
And two, how is someone going to weigh that out? How is that useful to them? If you want to educate people on titration, which is what we're talking about here, and that's an important thing, because a lot of times people talk about potency. And when I've had conversations with some of these folks, I've been like, you guys keep saying you're concerned about potency. You're not concerned about potency. You're concerned about titration. Potency is how much THC is in a particular product. Mm-hmm. Titration is how much THC someone is going to consume. You're worried that they're consuming too much. They're not titrating their consumption. There's a very different thing. And if you don't understand what's causing the problem or what you're worried about, you're not going to write good rules to fix it. So there was a lot of discussion about how, it should be 0.1 grams. It should be this. And I managed to get lucky enough that folks agreed with me that, like, the only solution was a visual representation. And there's other useful or semi-useful information in that pamphlet. And the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, insisted that it be physically attached to the product or receipt. And that is not an option from the Marijuana Enforcement Division.
Not an option.
And my feeling and my biggest frustration is that the proponents of that policy refused to allow a QR code to be used to convey the information. And these groups of individuals are very focused on protecting youth, which is really important. Like, the cannabis industry sells a drug, and we don't want that to get in the hands of children unless they're medical patients under the supervision of their parents or guardians. Okay, that makes total sense, and we can support that. Well, I have not really met a lot of people who would buy concentrates from a regulated marijuana dispensary and then resell them to a 15-year-old and then give them the educational pamphlet.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, it's not going to happen. And so there's this absolutely absurd situation where the goal is to protect the most vulnerable population, youth, who should not be accessing concentrates, but unfortunately, people don't do the right thing, and at times they do. And if we want to get the most vulnerable population good information about product safety and titration, you would want it on a QR code.
Exactly.
Right? Because they would still have access to it. Because there's not a lot of drug dealers out there that are like, here are your drugs and here is your educational safety pamphlet. And so it literally is one of these incredibly frustrating policies because it's super wasteful. And you have to give this to everybody who buys it. So if you have a customer that comes in week after week that buys the exact same product, every single time you have to give them this and they throw it in the garbage. And it's terrible for the environment and it's incredibly ineffective from a policy perspective. But again, direct your complaints to the right people, which in this instance would be the legislature saying, hey, this is really stupid. Can we at least put this on a QR code? And hopefully one day we will be able to go before the legislature in a rational discussion about this issue and get them to allow this information to be shared on a QR code, because it's certainly doing almost nobody any good at this particular moment.
I would love to see a QR code. I hope we can get there one day. I think the QR code, it stays on the packaging and with the container at all times, where this piece of paper, everyone's just throwing it away the second they get in their car, get out the door.
You're literally allowed to put a trash can next to your door.
Yeah.
And you had to have discussions about it because initially people wanted to make sure they were following the rules. So there wasn't an easy place to recycle the papers, and they were ending up in parking lots and and it was just like a mess everywhere. And so there were conversations had, and they were like, look, this is what the rules say. Can we put a recycle container by the door? And if you get lucky, then you can reuse the pamphlet over and over again too, which is helpful in the sense that we're not wasting things.
And then putting the burden of the cost on the operator to keep printing thousands of these flyers.
I mean, thousands of them. How many transactions for cannabis concentrate occurred in the state of Colorado last year?
I have clients that order 5,000 of those pamphlets. So
at a time.
To get the best pricing.
Yeah. And so how could you even imagine how much waste is going on here? It's an enormous amount of waste. And what's really important is we want consumers to have good consumer information.
Of course.
Right? It's like the idea that consumers should have access to information about safety use of a product, about titration of a concentrate, about who to call if you consume too much cannabis, about storing it out of the reach of children and pets, like all of these things. This is important consumer education and public safety information. So the idea that it's not in a QR code, that it's in this pamphlet that by its nature is not going to stay with the product, is not only wasteful, it actually is detrimental to public health and safety.
Yeah.
This policy is actually harmful to public health and safety, and in fact boxes out potential future efforts to provide better consumer information to patients and consumers, because the government's like, we fixed that already. We did that. We don't need to do that again. And it's, no, you did it stupid before. Can we fix it and do it right? And there's people who are very tied to this idea, and it's just perpetuated for years. And hopefully we'll get to a solution, but it is literally one of the worst ideas I've ever seen in cannabis policy. I've got lots I like to make jokes about, and I'm happy to get into them. But this one, it's not only wasteful and harming businesses, and consumers are frustrated. They're like, please stop giving me this. And the bud tenders, I have no choice. I have to give this to you. And so it creates conflict between customers and businesses.
It does.
It does all the time.
Especially like customers that keep coming back. It's really frustrating for the regulars. They're like, oh my gosh, they're handing me this piece of paper again.
Yeah, I don't want this. And again, it's not bad information. It's just about how you distribute said information to people.
I agree.
And doing it in a way that gives them access to it, that retains that access. And that can be very helpful. And so hopefully one day logic and reason will prevail, and we will have a really good informative consumer education material. The one that we have right now is pretty good. It probably could use some work, like everything in life. It's not terrible by any means. But at the same time, we'd like it to just stay with the product, which in a digital world, QR codes, what a brilliant idea.
Speaking of kind of things that get outrageous, like attaching that flyer over and over again, what are some policy changes that you have seen that you think have caught kind of operators off guard? And it doesn't have to be Colorado specific.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of policy changes that catch folks off guard because unfortunately still, although it doesn't happen as much these days, Folks, they're not aware of it enough. They don't pay enough attention. I think one of the most complicated policies and policy changes we see regularly is labeling changes.
Yeah.
Our firm actually just published a white paper on the current state of cannabis labeling and echoing back to our last conversation, QR codes and standards as the potential solution to what is an abject dumpster fire of a mess. But early on, especially, there would be a change to a labeling requirement or an adjustment to a labeling standard. And you need to think about sell-through periods. You need to think about sell-through at the manufacturer, sell-through at the dispensary, like this entire staging of this transition. And I think especially early on, it was just an abject, unmitigated disaster where there's like this date and time where everything needs to change. And early on, those changes were done. People don't know what they didn't know. States don't normally do labeling policy. It's normally handled at the federal level or international standards organizations like ASTM. So the regulators at the MED had no experience writing labels, let alone changing them. And so you'd have the rules would go into effect and the new labeling standards would come into effect 6 months later. And you learn over time that's not nearly enough. You need to like have the rules come into effect in January and then have a 6-month sell-through period of existing product and then a 6-month sell-through period at the dispensary. And then 12 months later, or even 18 months later, the actual new label is what's getting to the consumer and you have to mandate compliance. So labels is a good one to point out just because it has this kind of inherent lag time in a production scale, or otherwise you're spending a massive amount of money relabeling products. Yeah, an easy one to point to be like, that was something that I think caught people off guard, but also I think quite frankly caught everyone off guard. Compliance, regulators, attorneys, because it's just not normally done. Think about our food labels. There's a lot has changed in food production since I was a kid in terms of the number of unpronounceable words in our food, but the labels are pretty much the same. It was just like this entirely new paradigm, and there was a lot of learning to do, and there was a lot of challenges along the way. I think we've done a much better job over the years of identifying how you can solve for these things, but that's just an easy one to point to just because of the delta between how easy it is to write a change to a labeling standard and how much is involved in operationalizing the labeling standard.
Yeah, I think it's a good example of packaging and labeling. And this happens in every state from Michigan to Missouri. I've seen it all across the country.
And the labels never get shorter either. That was one of the fun things we talked about in the paper is that we identified, I think, about 30-something bills that increased labeling requirements in 2025, just in the first handful of months of this year. And guess how many bills reduced labeling requirements? 0.
None. Yeah. And I think, too, like being the first out of the gate, and then every time I see new emerging market, I'm like, oh, just wait to the labeling and packaging changes that are going to come. And it can cost an operator some money, especially if they already ordered all their labels or their packaging. We've seen it. Remember packaging changes happening in Colorado and the universal symbol changed, and all those people that had the manufacturers, they spent, I don't know, $50,000 on molds for their gummies or whatnot, had that universal symbol built into the mold. So because the gummy was going to have the stamp on it, and then having to change that universal symbol, it costs operators a lot of money to have to convert.
Although to be fair, the original universal symbol was an image of the Marijuana Enforcement Division badge, like a cop badge, which is one of the worst ideas ever. I'll never forget that day. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but I was just like, this is the worst idea anyone's ever come up with. And I've always insisted that there is only one universal symbol for cannabis in the whole world, and that's the pot leaf. It is the universal symbol. It is the one we all know and recognize. And the only thing that I like to say is universal about the universal symbol is that it's not universal. It's not consistent anywhere. Yeah. Colorado now is a warning style triangle with the letters THC in it and an exclamation point to indicate caution. Although I like to think it's yay THC. So at least there's something like good about it, but it still doesn't have a cannabis leaf on it, which why I don't know, but this is where we're at today in the world.
My other question is, do you think some of the regulations that you're seeing coming in the new emerging markets, are they going too far? Do you see states coming out too overregulated, or do you think they're just doing a little bit and that they're going to then come back and regulate more? Is it all over the board, do you think, right now across the U.S.?
First of all, I think it's all over the board. I think it's impossible to say it's not, because when you start talking about cannabis markets, like the state of Alabama just passed a bill regulating like hemp-derived THC edibles. So Is that a cannabis market or not? Like, I
Yeah.
don't, as far as I'm concerned, it's a cannabis market. They're selling THC derived from cannabis to adults. It's a cannabis market. So you see everything, right? And I think that to some extent, that's normal, right? The government's regulatory apparatus is different in Mississippi than it is in California, right? That is the exact, we're the United States, right? But there's individual states that are united together. So different states have the ability to govern the way they so choose. And I think that's a good thing. But yes, I think what you tend to see, especially in marijuana markets, is heavy-handed overregulation. And I think you see that on multiple fronts. I think one, excessive regulation to prevent things like diversion, where we ran a bill, House Bill 1209 here in Colorado to reduce camera coverage as required in dispensaries. And just without getting into the weeds of everything, it turns out that if you have like metric and a seed to sale tracking system, you probably don't need cameras on plants. Like, how many cameras in the United States of America do nothing but watch grass grow? Like a lot, like $100 million worth of video surveillance of cameras that do nothing but watch grass grow. So I think that's unnecessary and drives a lot of cost. One of the members of Colorado Leads was talking about it. He's got a 1,200 square foot dispensary in a town in Colorado and has 64 cameras in it. It's preposterous. It's completely not economical. So one of my new philosophies is if you have a regulation you think should be imposed on a cannabis dispensary, replace the word dispensary with liquor store. And if you say to yourself, shit, that wouldn't make any economic sense whatsoever, then you better rethink your regulation. If I were to tell you, you got to put 64 cameras in a 1,200 square foot liquor store, you'd be like, no, that would never work. Liquor stores couldn't afford that kind of regulatory burden. The market economics of a liquor store don't justify it. Yeah, there you go. So it probably doesn't make sense in cannabis. You also see a lot of efforts to control the market, a lot of efforts both on the licensing side of who gets a license and when they get a license. And some of that's necessary because we have intrastate markets, but also you end up with situations like in New York where they not only wanted to ensure that social equity was given a meaningful head start, but they wanted to control the algorithms of the platforms where products could be sold, wholesale and retail, to ensure that certain products were promoted or weren't promoted. And you just can't control everything in life. It's just not how the world works. And sometimes the more you try to control, the less good of job you do on everything else. And so you have situations where in an effort to control outcomes, you end up not doing a lot of different things well. And so I would always encourage regulators, start with the basics, regulate from there, build on top of your regulatory architecture, but don't exist in this fallacy where you can just control everything, because it just doesn't work that way. And it never has. I think 80 something percent of cannabis regulation at this juncture is probably overregulation.
That would bring me to my next question then. I always feel like Colorado, sometimes we're still the first to do some things. And do you think people can learn from Colorado? Because I find that we're streamlining a lot of our regulations now. I think you've been working on one recently.
Yeah, but it's been a multi-year project.
Yeah.
There was a bill last year that was passed by the legislature, and then another one this year that dealt with occupational licensing, so employee licensing, creating a lot of efficiency there, reducing the number of people. So now in Colorado, only the people who actually touch or transport the cannabis itself need to have an occupational license. That occupational license is a lifetime appointment as opposed to needing to be renewed every other year. If you really start doing the math, it's not like that expensive, but under a normal salary after taxes, you're talking about a day to 2 days worth of wages for a normal employee at a retail dispensary to renew their license. That matters when people live on fixed incomes.
The badge you're referring to.
Yeah, we call it colloquially the badge in the industry. So that it takes 13 mandatory areas of camera coverage down to 4. It takes 36 mandatory books and records that need to be held on the licensed premises for the current year and preceding 3 years down to, I think, 12 or something like that. Just like duplicative records. Like one of them was a copy of your license application. And when we met with the MED, we were like, you guys have it. Like, why is it a regulatory violation if someone doesn't have it? And they were like, cool, we just have one problem. When people don't have it, they end up asking us for it. And so what do you think if we like got rid of it, but instituted a fee? So if someone can't find it and they need to ask us for it, we can at least like charge them to send them a copy of it, because it takes us time and labor. And if that makes sense, if you can't keep your own books and records together, like, then someone has to get it for you. Sure, that's great. That's not a problem. It's not an administrative violation to not have a copy of it available for inspection. And so I think there's a ton that states can learn from what Colorado's
Yeah.
been doing, whether that's our genetics law, which was the first in the nation. This bill here that we passed, House Bill 1209, that Colorado leads, was one of the main proponents of. That is an enormous impact on this industry and something that we've never seen anywhere in the country. So I think it is an area where hopefully Colorado is taking leadership, but there's a lot of work to be done. Like I said, there's massive overregulation when you think about background checks of the financial analysis of owners and tracking where all the money's going and all of these other things. And it's like, okay, but is that really necessary? And is that because it's getting very costly? So they think there's a lot of conversations about licensing, which I think licensing should exist. I think selling a drug is a privileged license the same way it is in liquor. But like the process to get a liquor license, the process to get a marijuana license, let's just say there's a little difference between the two. Yeah, those differences. Right. It's a business. So, someone's got to do it. And it costs a tremendous amount of money. So things like macro licenses that we've been working on for a couple of years, hopefully. So a business like Native Roots that has 20 something facilities around the state that has dual licensure of state and local license. So they're renewing. I don't know if this number is exact. So we'll say fictitious cannabis business X in Colorado has 26 facilities that are dual licensed. That means they have 52 license renewals a year. 1 week a year, they are renewing the paperwork on a business that already exists to remind the state that the same people that owned this business last week still own it this week. And this isn't an option to the Marijuana Enforcement Division. This is how the regulations were structured and how the software, which is important, that they purchased to comply with the statute that they had to implement, does it. So now you can go, and these weren't contentious conversations. It was, hey, how do we create some efficiency here? Can we get a macro license for one business that has 26 facilities? Could they send you one application? And yeah, you might have to adjust fees, and fees could go up for a license renewal, but you only have to do something once. Like the amount of time and labor that you're spending is massive. So there's all kinds of savings all throughout the supply chain that need to be identified to allow businesses to be, I don't even want to get into profitable, but allow businesses to be viable and functional and continue employing people and continue paying good wages and benefits and all of the things that we want the cannabis industry to be able to do.
Yeah. Another question I was thinking about is, and I see this, like I said, I'm in the government work groups, and I always pay attention to how many people are joining the Zoom meetings, right? And I remember in the old days, the only option was to drive in, and now it's hybrid where you can go in person or you can Zoom in, which then allows people all across Colorado to Zoom in. Maybe nobody wanted to drive down from Grand Junction or Dinosaur, Colorado, and now they can get on the system and be part of the meeting. So that being said, why do you think some people are still reluctant to be engaged in that process, to pay attention to what's coming down the pipeline and the policies that are happening? People still doing that.
Why do we live in a democracy when half the people in the country vote, even in a presidential election?
Yeah.
I think, first of all, people are busy and they have a lot of responsibility, and running a cannabis business is one of the hardest businesses in the country to run. And it's not easy. And so sometimes you have to wake up and choose where you're going to spend your time. And maybe reality is you don't have time to invest in this process, and you don't have the resources to hire someone to spend that time for you. It is a public process. People say to me, like, it's bullshit that I have to hire a lobbyist to change a law. It's not bullshit, and you don't. You can go down and do it yourself. It's the people's building. I've seen citizen lobbyists pass bills before, and it'll happen again. But you have to spend the time. You can either spend the time yourself or hire someone to spend the time for you. And I think that's the case with MED rulemaking too, is that some people don't have the time. Other people don't feel like they can be influential or impactful, or other people got it. We've got a big tragedy, the commons issue here in the cannabis industry, where a lot of people don't even join the trade association. Like, it's been hard to get people to just kick in to support the one group of people that is actually fighting for the future of this industry in the state and contribute financially to that. So I think some people don't know, and they don't have experience with it. So it can be intimidating. Public speaking can be very intimidating if you're not used to it. So I think there's a myriad of reasons why people don't get engaged. And I think the Marijuana Enforcement Division has done a good job of trying to meet people where they're at, create a more open environment for people to participate in things. Remote access is one of them, and things like that. But at the end of the day, there are people who don't want to. There are people who think they're not going to be impactful. There are people who it gives them anxiety. There are people who are like, just tell me what the outcome is and I'll deal with it.
Yeah.
I hear that too. So I think there's a ton of reasons why people don't.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are entirely valid and legitimate. And there's no reason. If that's how they feel and they're like, whatever it is, I'll deal with it. And I don't want to be in the middle of it. And it's just not where I want to invest my time. Okay, sounds good to
Yeah.
me. And there are other people who probably could be really helpful that don't for whatever reason. It'd be great to get them off the sidelines. I would say, though, if you do own a cannabis business in Colorado or otherwise, you should be a member of the state's trade association. Because even if you're not willing to invest your time, you do need someone who's going to advocate on your behalf. Because in politics, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. And in Colorado, we have an amazing trade association called Colorado Leads that is a client of our firm and we work with. And it's like $5,000 for the year. It's not a huge expense. And these are the people who are fighting to make the industry more efficient and more operable, to defend against legislation that would have been massively problematic for the industry this year. Senate Bill 76 that would have basically banned people ages 21 to 25 from purchasing 98% of products in all dispensaries, whether they intended to or not. Run that bill, that's what it would have done. And so these are the people that are fighting for our industry. And I think it would be great if more people supported that fight, because it's quite frankly unfair to the folks who are funding that organization to have their colleagues riding their coattails. And so we hope people will continue to step up. I get things are tight and people are having a tough time. This is really the only way to fix it in a lot of ways, is to support these kinds of associations that are doing a lot of hard work to make things better for us.
Easy just to put your head in the sand and say, oh, someone else has got it. I don't need to think about it. And I'm overwhelmed. And it can be intimidating. When I first got into work groups, it took me a long time to get the courage to start doing the work groups and talking and raising my hand and being engaged. And I'm not even an owner of a cannabis business. And so I can only imagine the slew of reasons why people don't get engaged. So I think those were really good examples.
Yeah. And I don't think people should be judged for it. You do need to recognize that we are in a highly regulated industry, which means government regulations controls all of our market opportunities, good or bad. And at least helping support the folks who are fighting that fight, I think folks should do.
So I guess in wrapping up, I wanted to know if you could give some like common mistakes that you're seeing that operators can avoid when engaging with regulators.
Yeah, behave yourself. First and foremost, right? Honestly, like that is the tactics and tone are the most important thing of all. Think it through. Don't just throw a grenade into the middle of the room and be surprised when it blows up.
Yeah.
Understand what you're asking for. Understand the incentives of the regulators. They're there to protect public health and safety. And there's lots of ways to get there. So I always think, first of all, identify a problem. Articulate why it is a problem objectively, not personally. Objectively, it's a problem for businesses of this type because of this, right? If you were to do this differently, I recommend this way, you would still be able to accomplish your objective without this regulation that causes a problem, right? So be solution oriented, be professional. Remember, this is an industry and a community that's been dealing with 100 years of stigmatization. So if you go in there unprofessionally, or if you go in there and act the fool, like you are making all of us look bad. If you go in there without a plan or a solution, you could end up causing a lot of problems. And there may be some folks in the Colorado community that have maybe violated some of these recommendations in the last 6 months. Encourage them to take a step back. These regulators are people who have jobs to do. For the most part, they are well-intentioned, good, hardworking human beings who are probably not paid enough for the work they do. And they are certainly not paid enough to be screamed and yelled at by people who don't really understand what they're screaming and yelling about. It's like when you go to a restaurant, are you screaming and yelling at your server? Don't. Behave yourself. Think about it this way. If you behave in a certain way and your mother would be like, man, I'd be ashamed of you, then you probably shouldn't do it, right? Like, it's just not that complicated. Be nice to people, be respectful, be professional, and be solution oriented. Because these things, even if you don't agree with them, they came from a certain place. They came from someone who thought it was a good idea that was probably being well-intentioned. And so that doesn't mean they were right, but that doesn't mean that they're deserving of vitriol either, right? It means that you have to be an adult and behave like an adult and come up with a solution that makes sense and really think through what you're asking for. Because if you don't do those things, you're not going to get it. And you could actually risk making things worse. And you will at least continue some of the negative perceptions that people have of people in the cannabis community, which is not what we want. We want people to behave professionally, and we want people to be respectful of each other. And we
Yeah.
can disagree about this respectfully. And that's what we need to understand.
Yeah, I think that was beautifully said. And I've seen some outrageous behavior, and I'm always shocked. And I think, too, there's almost like a sense of entitlement that people feel they have the right to abuse somebody who works for the government because they feel they're paying their salary.
Yeah.
Oh, we're
You work
paying
for me
you
and we're paying you and blah, blah,
our
blah.
fees. You guys are getting our fees, so we
Yeah.
own you. And if people feel they have the right to abuse these
Yeah.
people, and I don't think it's fair. And I always try to stay like a really well-balanced person in the cannabis industry because I'm here to help operators, but I'm also here not to condone abuse to the regulators whatsoever. And let me tell you, I saw a video this weekend that was really shocking, and it's a total meltdown happening in California right now. People are really upset,
Yeah.
and people are screaming at each other. And I understand that these conversations get heated, but I think it's gotten to the point where there's no more respect and people can't even have a normal conversation. It's just a total screaming match right now. But it has to get to that point, and operators are completely frustrated in California, and they have every right to be frustrated. They're upset about the taxes.
Yeah. Yeah. And they should be. And there's a lot
Yeah.
of reasons why people have a right to be upset in California. There's a lot of reasons why people have a right to be upset in Colorado. It's not
Yeah.
perfect. But that doesn't mean you can scream and yell at the person who didn't even make the decision that you're angry about and that is doing their best. And you just catch more flies with honey. It's an old saying, but it's not wrong. Be nice, be
Yeah.
respectful, be empathetic, understand where they're coming from, understand
Yeah.
why these things exist. Like, these rules exist because someone thought they were necessary to protect public health and safety. You might not think they're necessary, and you might be right. But there was someone who thought it was a good idea at some point. There's certain things in California that I know where they did do certain things to screw people over. So
Yeah.
putting that part aside. But for the most part, and I feel like Colorado, we're very lucky. Everyone really does, I think, for the most part, behave in a well-intentioned way. Doesn't mean they're right. Doesn't mean you shouldn't fight against it. It's a question of how, right? It's how do you approach the situation? And if you want a good solution, you know, I'm a parent. Turns out, and this is what I try to teach my kid, throwing a tantrum ain't gonna get what you want.
It's
If you
not.
don't like daddy's decision, we can talk about it. But if you throw a tantrum, I'm 100% not going to give you what you want.
Yeah.
Guaranteed. Because I'm not going to incentivize that behavior. And I think it's true in the same thing, right? Behave yourself. Don't throw a tantrum. Be a professional. Come up with a solution. Don't show up just to complain, right? Because that doesn't get you anybody anywhere. Come up with a solution. Say, hey, I hear you. I understand why we have this rule in place. I understand and value also the importance of protecting youth. But this particular rule does not actually have the benefit that we think it does. And you can actually accomplish your goal more effectively this way.
Yeah.
And if you can articulate those things, I think you can have a huge impact on public policy.
Yeah. Well, I want to sneak one more thing in. What can these new emerging markets, these states, what is one takeaway you can give them that they can learn from Colorado and everything that we've been through regarding policy?
It's a billion things. I think one of the things I've talked about for a long time is the Colorado model is not necessarily the words on the page. Although it's been funny watching other states go through and like their legislature lamb-based Colorado as the one thing we're not going to do in this bill is become Colorado. And that's cool, but I can go through your statute and your regulations and find stuff I wrote in Colorado that you copied and pasted. So it still happens, but listen to your stakeholders, and engage with each other. And always the best ideas come from people working collaborative with each other. So the Colorado model's not the words on the page. It's the process that we use to get there. And it's a very collaborative process. Fastest way to get your bill killed in the state of Colorado is don't stakeholder it. Stakeholder your bill. Talk to the people who don't agree with you. Try to come up with a solution that everyone can live with. And I think in new states, that's the most important thing is talk and have discussions where you can work together to create the best ideas. Because most of the time, people do this with good intentions. And there are outliers, and that's for sure. I'm not so naive to not think that. But I think most people are trying to do the right thing. And I think sometimes we need to listen to each other more. And I think that applies to a lot of the problems in our country.
Yeah. Thank you. That was perfect. So thank you for summing that up for me at the end. And I want to thank our listeners for joining us today. Myself, Jenny Germano, and Jordan Wellington. If you're going to be looking for my podcast, you can find it on my YouTube channel, Under the Microscope with Jenny, or you can also stream to listen on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Amazon Music. And then also, Jordan, why don't you give a shout out to your podcast and if people want to listen to yours and where they find it?
Yeah, it's called Weed Wonks. We have regulators, industry members, all kinds of people on there talking about all kinds of fun, nerdy stuff. We try to keep it a little silly as much as we can. And we're on, I think, like Apple and Stitcher and Spotify and like normal podcast places. Don't quote me on that. I record the podcast, and thank God I have people who help with some of the technical end of it. And my job is to make mediocre weed dad jokes and try to have a good time with folks. But yeah, it's like one of my favorite things in the world. So give us a listen, have a good time. I think we got a negative review at one point where it said it's full of irreverent patter with lauding people for their roles in government. And I was like, that's incredibly complimentary. We are all about irreverent patter here. And so I'm sorry that this individual didn't enjoy the silliness, but I hope other people do. And so I took it as a compliment that he was like, yeah, that I read the review and I was like, that's spot on. That's exactly what we're going for.
Perfect.
And
I would just make a t-shirt out of it, honestly.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea at some point. I'm going to have to call up one of my buddies who does a t-shirt, has a Artist Proof Collective here in Denver, Colorado. Great company. Shout out to them. All your t-shirt making needs.
Thanks again. And we'll talk to everyone later. Thank you.
Thank you.